Friends, Jane Curcio back with Breaking Bread for you. And in this presentation, we are going to examine part 3 of the story of Abraham from chapters 16 through 18, including the birth of Ishmael, the amending of the Abrahamic covenant, the change of Abram's and Sarai's name, and Abraham's mediation over Sodom and Gomorrah. Beginning in chapter 16, verse 1, it is written, Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, See now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Notice here that Sarai believes that it is the Lord who has restrained her from becoming pregnant. Yet instead of waiting on God to unrestrain her, she goes ahead of him and pleads with Abram, saying, Please go into my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her. And Abram heeded the voice of Sarai. Based on Avram's trust in God to provide for him, as he had emphatically expressed to the king of Sodom in chapter 14, it is surprising that he didn't protest here. Instead, he heeded the voice of Sarai, as it is said, an Hebraic expression for obeying all that she had said. This recalls Adam, who without protest obeyed all that Eve had said, resulting in the curses laid upon mankind, Genesis 3:14 through 19. And because of Avram's lack of trust in God's promises, his descendants through Isaac are cursed till today. Yet we shouldn't be too hard on Abram and Sarai, for in that culture, barrenness was one of the worst things that could happen to them, given the expectation to produce a male heir to carry on his name and legacy. Now, in the ancient Near East, there were 3 things that could be done about an infertile wife, with one or all included in the marriage contract, the ketubah. The first would be divorce. This was the least favored option since it would financially disadvantage the husband, resulting from the wife returning to her family with her dowry. Secondly, the husband could use a concubine as a surrogate mother, most often a servant, referred to as polykoite. And thirdly, the husband could take a second wife, polygamy, as had Abram, as it is mentioned in verse 3, where it says, Then Sarai, Avram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, and gave it to her husband Abram to be his wife, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. And the mention of Abram dwelling in the land for 10 years stresses the length of time they had been waiting for Sarai to conceive. Also, scholars point out that the mention of Hagar's Egyptian ancestry was intentional to enforce the prohibition of marrying foreigners, which was of great interest to Moses and Aaron. It was under the leadership of Moses and Aaron that the ban on intermarriage became law, outlined in Deuteronomy 7:1 through 6, where it says, You shall make no covenant with them, foreigners, nor show mercy to them, nor shall you make marriages with them. You shall not give your daughter to their son, nor take their daughter for your son, for they will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods. So the anger of the Lord will be aroused against you and destroy you suddenly. The Mosaic prohibition of intermarriage is supported in the records of the disastrous outcome of Avram's marriage to Hagar. And when Hagar conceives, things go terribly wrong for Avram and Sarai, as is often the case when not waiting on the Lord for his plan to unfold in his time. In verse 4 it says, So we went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes. Then Sarai said to Avram, My wrong be upon you. That are translated from the Greek Septuagint, I am injured by you. And she continues, I gave my maid into your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, I became despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between you and me. So Abram said to Sarai, indeed, your maid is in your hand. Do to her as you please. Here Abram appears to not want to be bothered about Sarai's crisis, as if he had nothing to do with it at all. Things don't go well for Hagar either, as we learn from verse 6. And when Sarai dealt harshly with Hagar, she fled from her presence. But God intervenes where it says in verse 7, now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. Geographers of the ancient Near East locate Shur in the Arabian desert near the northeast corner of Egypt, indicating that Hagar had attempted to return to Egypt. And in verse 8 it goes on to say, and the angel of the Lord said, Hagar, Sarai's maid, where have you come from, and where are you going? She said, I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit yourself under her hand. Then the angel of the Lord said to her, I will multiply your descendants exceedingly, so that they shall not be counted for multitude. Here the angel assures her that she would be blessed with many descendants, as was promised to Abram and Sarai, but only if she returned to serve Sarai. This harks back to God's promise to Abram, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. Genesis 12:3. And for returning to serve Sarai, Hagar gave birth to Ishmael, the father of 12 Arab tribes. Although many take it that the angel of the Lord was God, if that were so, I think that it would have said that the Lord appeared to Hagar, as is said about when the Lord appeared to Abram on several occasions. In fact, the messenger in Hagar's case is revealed as being an angel in verse 11, where it is said, behold, you are with child, and you shall bear a son, you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction. And because the Lord heard her affliction, the child was named Ishmael, meaning God hears. And it continues to say about Ishmael in verse 12, he shall be a wild man, his hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him. And he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. This is not what a mother would want to hear about her son, yet Hagar might have thought it good to have a brutish son to rescue her out of Sarai's hands. So Avram was blessed with descendants who became the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. Because he did not trust God in providing him an heir, his descendants would remain under the curse of incessant opposition in establishing the nation of Israel. Not only would opposition come through Ishmael's descendants, but from the Canaanites, the Philistines, and other native groups in the land. However, the worst curse upon God's people is when they were outside of the land, as when they remained in Egypt after Joseph, where they became enslaved. And for God's blessing to return to his people, they had to return to the land. The reasons the Hebrews became enslaved in Egypt was to get them back to the land of blessing, to restore them to the covenant blessings. The Holocaust did not affect Jews in the land, but those who were determined to live outside of the land. And when 600,000 Jews returned to the land when freed from Hitler's death camps, they were blessed with democratic nationhood, prosperity, and now numbering 7 million. And every day, Jews from around the world are returning to the land of blessing. And in verses 13 and 14, it says that Hagar called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are El Roi, the God who sees. For she said, have I also here seen him who sees me? Therefore the well was called Be'er Lahai Roi, which means well of the one who lives and sees me. Observe it is between Kadesh and Bered. And chapter 16 is summarized in verses 15 and 16. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram named his son, whom Hagar bore Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. The story of Abraham picks up again in chapter 17, where God makes a covenant with Abram. Now, you might be wondering, didn't God already cut a covenant with Abram in chapter 15, where it says in verse 18, on the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I have given this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. And if you will recall, God guaranteed that covenant with the ceremony of the walking between the animal pieces. So why a second covenant? Well, there are two strains of thought about what appears to be a repetition of the Abrahamic covenant. The first is that God actually cut two covenants with Abram. The first, an unconditional covenant in which God promises him reputation, land, and countless descendants who will bless the nations. The second covenant is conditional, requiring Abram to be perfect, to be circumcised, and to circumcise every male in his household, which his descendants are bound to do thereafter. The second thought is that chapter 15 was written by the documentary source referred to as the Yahwist, thought to be a scribe in King David's court, whose main interest was in the inheritance of the land in order to establish the nation of Israel. But the covenant in chapter 17 is from the priestly writer, whose main concern was that Israel walk uprightly and that all male infants keep covenant through circumcision. Not only did the compilers of the 5 books of Moses consider that the multiple documents of the same accounts were sacred, therefore not willing to omit any of them from the Torah, but that each documentary source had something more to contribute to the scriptures. And we move on in chapter 17, where it says, when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty, El Shaddai. Walk before me and be blameless. Now, the word for blameless is tamim here, which is usually translated perfect. Here, Avram learns God's name, not as Yahweh, his name later revealed to Moses in Exodus 6:3, but as El Shaddai, God Almighty. This name is used 6 times in the Old Testament, and not to be confused with Almighty God, El Gibor. And this is the first time God commands Abram to walk before him and be blameless. Better translated in the Greek Septuagint, be well-pleasing before me and be blameless. Abram would have understood that to be well-pleasing and blameless is to obey God's commands. We can say that this is a stipulation of the amended covenant, since God connects being well-pleasing before him and blameless with the conjunction and, where he continued to say, and I will make my covenant between me and you, and will multiply you exceedingly. Then Avram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, as for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be a father of many nations. And then Avram is told, no longer shall your name be called Avram, but your name shall be Avraham, for I have made you a father of many nations. Now about Avram's name change to Avraham. I mentioned in a last session that a conquering king would often install the defeated ruler as his vassal lord or puppet king in order to better control the people in his absence. And the king would cut a covenant treaty with his vassal lord, referred to as the suzerain vassal treaty. One of the marks of this treaty was that the name of the vassal lord was changed by the king. For the vassal, this would be a great imposition, since their names were often tied to their god, their destiny, and their fame as the ruler of their nation. Being stripped of their names would have had a humbling effect on a defeated king, a reminder that he was no longer sovereign, but the mere puppet king of a foreign potentate. Now, ancient Israel was quite familiar with this practice, as we read in the book of Kings. For instance, Judah's king Jehoahaz was deposed by King Necho of Egypt in 605 BC, who replaced him with his older brother Eliakim as a puppet king, changing his name to Jehoiakim, 2 Kings 23:34. Also, in 597 BC, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon deposed Judah's king Jeconiah and installed the 20th and last king, Jeconiah's uncle Mattaniah, changing his name to Zedekiah. 2 Kings 24:19 through 20 and Jeremiah 52:2 and 3. But in the case of Abram and Sarai, God changing their names was not meant to humble them, but to exalt them, giving them a better name for a better destiny. Avram would have known from his Sumerian background that by God changing his name to Abraham, from exalted father to father of many nations, it was to mark the covenant that God made with him, and that it was bona fide and binding. And since Sarah was part of the covenant, her name was changed from Sarai to Sarah, from meaning my princess to princess absolute, since she would become the grandmother of the 12 princes of the 12 tribes of Israel. And we can liken the changing of names in covenant agreements to that of the marriage contract or covenant, when the bride's surname is changed to her husband's, becoming one with her husband. In the case of Abraham, by keeping covenant with God, he becomes spiritually one with God, as we do in the new covenant, becoming spiritually one with Christ. The Lord continues to say to Abraham in verse 6, I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you in their generations, for an everlasting covenant to be God to you and your descendants after you. Genesis 17:6 and 7. Also, I give to you and your descendants after you the land in which you are a stranger, all the land of Canaan, as an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. And in verse 9, we find a second stipulation of this covenant. And God said to Abraham, As for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you throughout their generations. Here we learn that the Abrahamic covenant is eternal, not replaced with the Mosaic covenant, which had its own purpose, to teach Israel how to live for a holy God, because unlike Abraham, they had not. And the final stipulation of the covenant between Abraham and God, as already mentioned, is that every male child be circumcised as a sign of the covenant, verses 10 and 11. And in verse 12, it begins to say, He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised, every male child in your generations. He who is born in your house or bought with money from any foreigner who is not your descendant. He who is born in your house and he was bought with your money must be circumcised. And my covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. And the uncircumcised male child who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. And to be cut off from Israel was as dire a judgment as could be for any Israelite. And in verses 15 and 16 is where Sarai's name is changed. Then God said to Abraham, as for Sarai your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. And I will bless her and also give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of peoples shall be from her. And Sarai's name change was to assure that the promised child would be born to her and not to Hagar. And in verse 17 it goes on to say, Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? And shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? Now, laughter is a theme in the Abraham narrative. Abraham laughed over becoming a parent in his old age, as did Sarah in the next chapter, who laughed when the angels announced to them that she would soon conceive. And they named the child of promise Isaac, which means laughter. Named so by Sarah, who said that all who hear will laugh with her. Genesis 21:6. And it continues to say in verse 18, And Abraham said to God, Oh, that Ishmael might live before you. Abraham still doesn't believe that he will father a son with Sarah, to which God responds, No, Sarah your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his descendants after him. And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. He shall beget 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. Here the covenant and all its blessings are passed over Ishmael and passed down to Isaac, saying in verse 21, But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this set time next year. Then he finished talking with him, and God went up from Abraham. The theme of the younger son being chosen as leaders over the older siblings begins with Isaac over Ishmael, continuing with Jacob over Esau and Joseph over Reuben. And this theme continues with Moses over Aaron, Gideon over his older brothers, Kings David and Solomon over theirs. And then chapter 17 ends with Abraham being circumcised at 99 years of age, along with 13-year-old Ishmael and all the male servants in his household. And Abraham's story continues in chapter 18 with the visitation of the Lord and two angels. And I quote, Then the Lord appeared to him, Abraham, by the terebinth trees of Mamre, as he was sitting in the tent door in the heat of the day. So he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing by him. And when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them, and bowed himself to the ground, and said, My Lord, if I have now found favor in your sight, do not pass on by your servant. Now Abraham does not address them all, but only one of them, calling him my Lord. In this case, it can be said with certainty that he was the Lord, and Abraham would have recognized him since he had appeared to him several times before. And in verse 4, Abraham said to the Lord, Please let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. And I will bring a morsel of bread that you may refresh your hearts. After that you may pass by, inasmuch as you have come to your servant. And as we know, it was customary to bring water to guests to wash the dust off of their feet and to offer them a meal. Now Abraham is told, do as you have said. So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah and said, quickly, make ready 3 measures of fine meal, knead it and make cakes. And Abraham ran to the herd, took a tender and good calf, gave it to a young man, and he hastened to prepare it. So he took butter and milk and the calf which he had prepared, and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree as they ate. And they said to him, where is Sarai, your wife? So he said, here in the tent. And he said, I will certainly return to you according to the time of life. And behold, Sarai, your wife, shall have a son. Sarai was listening in the tent door, which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarai were old, well advanced in age, and Sarai had passed the age of childbearing. Therefore Sarai laughed within her, saying, after I have grown old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being also old? And the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I surely bear a child since I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time I will return to you according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. But Sarah denied it, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. And he said, no, but you did laugh. The Lord is not amused with Sarah here, due to her lack of belief that she had expressed before when giving her husband to Hagar to produce a son. And knowing the repercussions of that unbelief, the Lord should be disturbed. Then verse 16 introduces the next episodes in Abraham's story, where it says, then the men rose from there and looked towards Sodom, and Abraham went with them to send them on their way. In verses 17 and 19, the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am doing, since Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? For I have known him, in order that he may command his children and his household after him, that they keep the way of the Lord, to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has spoken to him. Wouldn't we love to know that God thinks the same of us? And so the Lord decides to share with his servant Abraham what he is about to do with Sodom and Gomorrah, saying in verses 20 and 21, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grave, I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry against it that has come to me, and if not, I will know. Then the men turned away from there and went toward Sodom, but Abraham still stood before the Lord. And here is where Abraham demonstrates his skill at mediation, and where God demonstrates his mercy for the righteous and judgment for the wicked. And Abraham came near and said, would you also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there were 50 righteous within the city. Would you also destroy the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous that were in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing as this, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous should be as the wicked. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? What an incredible and bold mediator Abraham reveals himself to be here. And he could do that because he knew the nature and character of his God, who is just and merciful, and pleads his case based on that to save Sodom. And the Lord responds to Abraham in verse 26, saying, if I find in Sodom 50 righteous within the city, then I will spare all the place for their sakes. Then Abraham answered and said, And he does so with great humility. Indeed, now, I am who but dust and ashes. I have taken it upon myself to speak to the Lord. Suppose there were 5 less than the 50 righteous. Would you destroy all the city for the lack of 5? So he said, If I find there 45, I will not destroy it. And he spoke to him yet again and said, Suppose there should be 40 found there. How clever Abraham is, reducing the numbers of possible righteous people in increments of 5s and then 10s. This reminds me of a child who asks for a small amount of money from his parents and then nickels and dimes them until he gets what he really wants. And the Lord responds again, saying in verses 29 and 31, I will not do it for the sake of 40. Then he said, Let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak. Suppose 30 should be found there. So he said, I will not do it if I find 30 there. And he said, Indeed now I have taken it upon myself to speak to the Lord. Suppose 20 should be found there. So he said, I will not destroy it for the sake of 20. Now, in the effort to keep the Lord from losing his patience, Abraham says in verses 32 and 33, Let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak but once more. Suppose 10 should be found there. And he said, I will not destroy it for the sake of 10. So the Lord went his way as soon as he had finished speaking with Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. But sadly, there were not 10 righteous there, and the Lord knew that all along. And that ends part 3 of the story of Abraham, and I hope that you will return next week for part 4. Be blessed in every area of your lives as you study God's Word and apply it to your lives.